So the four main teaching strategies for longer term learning are discussed in your book, along with an explanation of the science behind them. Now, retrieval practice, which you just described to us, is one of these strategies. Can you give further details on the other three strategies?
The four strategies in powerful teaching are so powerful, we call them power tools. Each one has been robustly researched. So retrieval is one, or retrieval practice. The second is spacing, or spaced practice. The third is interleaving. And the fourth is metacognition, or feedback-driven metacognition. So in the last question I answered, I talked about, the purpose of wanting to get information from our working memory into long-term by spacing out retrieval. And that's spacing, because again, we know that as soon as we start learning something, we start forgetting it. So we have that forgetting curve, and spacing helps with that forgetting curve. Briefly, the forgetting curve is if after 24 hours, you do a quick retrieval, and in 3 days, a quick retrieval, and in a week, a quick retrieval. And again, it doesn't have to be graded. It can be something easy, and I have all sorts of strategies to help with that. But spacing out that retrieval helps get that information into your long-term memory. Interleaving is also so important, and it's probably the least understood. Interleaving compares similar content, and it helps allow students to compare and contrast. Interleaving is what really helps us get to critical thinking, deep thinking. It helps with the transfer of knowledge. So let me give an example. When I taught world history, in my classes, it was the first time that world history was taught in our curriculum. My students were 11 years old. And so I would always start with a unit with an essential question, such as when we were learning about the ancient river civilizations, there was the Nile, there was the Tigris and Euphrates. As we went along, I could have taught the Nile and never gone back. I could have taught Tigris and Euphrates and never gone back. So many of our textbooks are designed that way. But instead, with my essential question, I would have that up on the board at the beginning of the unit and say, how did flooding affect each of the ancient river civilizations? So by the time we finished the unit, the students could go back and talk about flooding in the Nile, which was very different from the flooding in the Tigris and Euphrates, and, from the Ganges and from the Huang. So they were able to look globally. Or when I was teaching about revolutions, whether it was the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the United States, the American Revolution, my essential question was, how did social pyramids change as a result of revolutions? And so the students, in order to answer that question, I'm comparing similar content of revolutions, but they are able to discriminate, to compare and contrast. That is interleaving. So we have retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and the final one is metacognition, knowing what we know versus what we don't know. And the key is feedback. Too often I would have a student come in and say, "Oh, I studied so hard for the test. I'm going to ace it. I studied for hours last night." And you're so excited. You're rooting for this student. And as you're grading tests that night, this student's paper comes up. And oh my goodness, they didn't do well at all. That is common. And it's because students tend to study what they already know. And too often, we as teachers don't give them the tools to discriminate what they know from what they don't know. So I developed several strategies. And again, there's going to be a link that you can download my strategies for free that allows students to test their metacognition. Remember when I talked about retrieval is something that is low stakes or no stakes that you use as a process throughout the course of study. One of the reasons why you do that is to help your students judge their metacognition, if they know it or not. And when we give our students the tools for that discrimination, what happens is they can spend less time studying because they've already identified those areas that they don't know. And students do better. If students spend so much time studying and they don't do well, what happens? Students eventually stop studying, right? They give up. That doesn't have to happen. We can teach our students the wonderful opportunities of metacognition. Retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and metacognition.
And I think I agree with you totally. I believe that teachers, it's so crucial that teachers teach these strategies to the students. It's not a matter of just delivering the content, but I think if we teach them these skills, then they'll be able to use these skills in every subject and find it easier.
Absolutely.
So it would be upsetting for a teacher to use retrieval practice in class and elicit students' incorrect answers when her goal during that lesson may be to build on that prior knowledge to go on to the next stage of the concept being taught. Every teacher's fear. As an experienced educator, are you concerned about students retrieving the wrong answer during your lesson?
No. Absolutely not. In fact, I told you how on the first day I tell my students, I'm going to teach you how to learn. Front and center in my classroom was a big sign that says, it's okay to make mistakes. That's the way we learn. Mistakes help target what we don't know. And so if students are making errors or forgetful during a class or having difficulty, combining it with long-term memory, I called that a desirable difficulty, and I would embrace those. In fact, I would say, we have a DD, a desirable difficulty going on. Let's embrace this, because if one student is having difficulty, chances are more than one student is having that difficulty. And that would give me the opportunity to go ahead and go over that again and have class discussions and turn-in talks. That is where your learning happens. Too often students might get something correct, but they guessed at the answer. They don't know why they got it right. And so having a classroom where we embrace this because it targets what needs learning. And that's another reason why it should be low stakes or no stakes. While our students are learning, we don't want to judge. We don't want those grades to go in the grade book. We want them to be like flow charts of where to go next. If we need to circle back and go over it, or now we go on. So often teachers think that that is a negative thing. I think it's something to celebrate because it gets our students on the right path to learning. So when that big test does come, they're so ready.
So every year, many teachers express dissatisfaction over how poorly the students retain the knowledge they would have learned the previous year. Very, very common in schools. The strategies you just described to us are just one example of how changing methods to include research-based principles of learning science has significantly enhanced and impacted your students' recall of material and has been a life changer for them. In what specific ways has this changed your students' lives?
Well, to get back again, remember, too often, and it's kind of a, I don't know, little story that you spend the first several weeks simply reviewing what was taught the year before. But when you use those power tools of retrieval and spacing and interleaving and metacognition, you don't have to spend that time because the students know it. When they have retrieved throughout a course a year, they know that information. So how did I do that? I had what I called my big ticket items. And those were, I would look ahead to what is going to be on my semester exam, what is going to be on my chapter test, what is it that my students need to know for next semester or for next year. And so I would call those my big ticket items. And I would make sure that those are the things that I would retrieve. We can't retrieve everything as teachers or we would never get ahead. But being able to identify those big ticket items, those are the things that we would have our students retrieve. And I would do it through blasts from the past questions, through mini quizzes, through all sorts of activities and strategies that I would use. The benefits are that my students remembered this information. Every year, remember, I taught students when they were 11, I would get emails from former students who are now in college who would say, oh, today we talked about Charlemagne and I remembered that he was blah, 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 blah. You know, they remember. Or one time I put this example in Powerful Teaching. I went to get some takeout at a Thai restaurant and nobody knew I was going to be there. And two of my former students who were seniors in high school happened to walk in. I had not seen them in 6 years. They weren't expecting to see me. I wasn't expecting to see them. And they say, Mrs. Bain. And they immediately started, it was like a volleyball, a rally, a tennis match of information going back and forth, and they would keep adding to it. And I'm just watching this, looking from one student to the next. Everything they said was correct. And this was all information in their long-term memory. And as teachers, we work way too hard to spend all this time teaching to only have our students forget it. And our students, think of how many years they sit in our classrooms. They work too hard to not have this information retained. And so simply by learning how to learn and teaching our students this, it's such a big win for all of us, and they will retain the information.
Now, some researchers find that frequent tests can boost learning. Locally, we tend to rely on timed testing to assess our students, which most of the time involves regurgitating what they have memorized few days before. In order for students to be able to build on the prior knowledge that was tested in the assessments, is this technique of assessing, testing, examining effective enough for them to be able to retain the knowledge they have learned over the long term?
Yes, considering how it's done. You know, you can't just test and move on and not go back, or that's where we have the forgetting curve and where we're basically starting at point zero, having to reteach everything. So using those tests and quizzes, using retrieval as that process, incorporating spacing, so you space out that important information so that you allow the transfer, that interleaving of linking the new knowledge to what's there, helping your students, really dig deep. A misconception of retrieval is that it's basic regurgitation of facts, but that is not necessarily true. What we need to do as teachers is to make sure that we use a mix of questions. It can be simple recall, but we also need to get to those deep level thinking questions. And then again, of course, metacognition. Are the students allowed to get that information back between those tests of what they know and what they don't, so they know what to work on? So yes, using those tests frequently, it works, but how you do it is what's important.